Perfect. So I will start this in Portuguese first, and then we change back to English. Yeah. Então, eu queria agradecer a todo mundo que veio hoje na nossa terceira aula, conversa aqui. Como vocês sabem, é muito importante, especialmente hoje, no dia que alguém está na rua celebrando, comemorando o golpe, com mais de 300 mil mortes. Eu acho que a gente sentar aqui e poder conversar sobre o que a gente, como arquiteto, pode fazer. Tá? Então, eu vou apresentar o John McMorrough. Eu vou começar essa apresentação em inglês, tem alguns alunos dele também, e vocês já sabem, qualquer coisa, qualquer problema, manda no YouTube ali, no chat, as perguntas, e eu vou lendo. Ele vai começar uma apresentação, ali uns 10, 15 minutos, e depois a gente vai conversar sobre isso, beleza? And now, in English, I wanna thank John McMorrough for coming. I thought a lot about how to introduce John. It's for me, he doesn't know it, but he's like a super important reference I had. It's not a coincidence. I think I brought like just two books that really shaped me in architecture. The Harvard Guide to Shopping, which is amazing. And there's like a couple of texts from John while he was a student, which is, I mean, super impressive to have this output. And probably one of my favorite articles in architecture that is in this little magazine, not so well known, about program, and it shaped my thesis, and like there are quite a few years while I was thinking of what was in the magazine. John is, he's a professor at Tubman College in Michigan. He's coordinating, is associate professor coordinating the PhD. He has an architecture design office called Studio APT, or APT, Architecture Practice and Theory. I had to cheat a bit because the CV is long, but I want to point especially his working around the world is as an architect, and also in his student years with a master and a PhD at GSD at Harvard, with a super interesting thesis titled Prehistory of Postmodern, which the idea of pre and history of post, it's all super I don't know, interesting and a bit questionable if we can talk about it. So what we're gonna talk about today, I will share here like a couple of slides before we really start, and I guess you can see. So as I said, this is the third Ideas to postpone the end of the world, especially for John's students. There's this little book by a Brazilian, an Amazon native Brazilian thinker, philosopher, and he tries to give reasons why we should or shouldn't postpone the end, or what it means to be human and to have an end, which is, I think is crucial, especially in this moment we're living here today, especially in Brazil, but everywhere. So thank you very much, John. It's really a great pleasure and honor to have you here. I'm super excited. Thanks.
Great.
If you wanna,
yeah. Great. Thank you. Gosh, Thiago, that's such a generous introduction. But then also, when you read my dissertation title, I realize maybe I haven't come very far, because what I want to talk about today involves history and pretexts and results. We talked about different formats. I'm going to give a bit of a presentation, mostly to throw some concepts up in the air. You have to enable my screen sharing, though, for me to do that.
Can I just, I just want to say one quote before
sure.
you start, and then I will let you in. I know this is rude, but just to keep in mind, I want to say to this, so if any of my students don't know this project, 1 and 3 chairs, I guess we're going to touch on something like this, chair, what it means, I don't know. And my favorite book and my most crazy book, The War and Peace, when I just want to leave with this, and then I will get out of the way, with the idea that Tolstoy says he knows there's something stronger and more important than his will, that is the inevitable march of events. And I think this concept of the inevitable march of events, it's very important today, and it's very poignant to talk about. With that, I will see what I can do here, because I stop and...
Okay, I've got access, great. So I think the quote is sort of fantastic and really sets up maybe even more than you could have realized what I want to talk about today, which is precisely those inevitable march of events and how inevitable we might understand them. I want to do that by sort of launching a concept of counterfactual architecture histories. And it's kind of a mouthful. And I think for the first half of the presentation, I want to qualify some of these terms of like how I mean them, or how I understand them rather. And then the second half, unpack what I think this might mean in relationship to now. And I want to thank Thiago again for such a generous introduction, and also the chance to participate in this forum. I mean, this talk is sort of both facilitated and limited by COVID. I think the thoughts that I'm going to relate to you today have been forged in the smithy of isolation. And yet, because we're all been isolated and now use Zoom all the time, we can have these great connections. So I appreciate the chance to sort of test what these things are. And I would really want to frame what I'm about to say as a kind of thought experiment. It's a thought experiment about like how we might understand architecture's relationship to history in different ways. And I'm going to do that in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about, first, introduce the counterfactual and why I think it is the right theoretical trope or armature or device for today, like in this moment in history. And then I want to talk about later, in terms of times, like later or the future, and architecture's relationship to future and futurity as part of its, like one of its defining characteristics. And then finally, I want to talk about history. I want to talk about then, and what those, how we understand architecture's particular relationship to history. Maybe different than what Tolstoy meant. Maybe it's a different kind of history, and how we relate to that. I'm going to first start with this idea of the counterfactual. And the counterfactual is very simply, basically describes sort of what if propositions. So what if something happened and then something else would happen? It would be, but they're more like from yeah, we'll unpack this. It's a lot to unpack. The counterfactuals has a kind of rich, deep, and complicated history and philosophy. It starts with David Lewis really sort of bringing it to the fore in his possible world analyses. It comes out as a kind of like technical consideration of what the conditions are of the actual world and how many of those conditionals would stay the same for potential other outcomes. It gets very technical, very dense. I have to admit, I don't fully understand all of the conditions because it's very much a sort of symbolic logic proposition, but at the very essence, it's about sort of testing the idea of causality. If this becomes that, if this condition changes in the past, what would that be possible to change in the future? And so it's really a sort of formalist testing of how we even conceptualize causality through semantic language models. Now, why this interest in semantic language models now? And I think it really has to do with something like this. This is an example you probably all know quite well. This is from our former president at his inauguration for some years ago. On the one side, we see the inauguration 4 years before that for President Obama. On the other side, we see the inauguration for President Trump. This visual fact seems to indicate to us, probably correctly in the end, that more people were at Obama's administration than Trump's. Like, it's a kind of visual evidence, a visual fact. This was one of the first controversies to come out of the Trump administration, where the press secretary comes out and says Trump had a bigger inauguration, Trump says he had a bigger inauguration. And Kellyanne Conway, who was the press secretary at the time, gives an interview in which she gives this question and christens it alternative facts. That the Trump administration had access to alternative facts, which show that this is actually a bigger crowd. And it's a kind of a big joke, because you see here, like, well, clearly we have proof of one thing over the other. Let's be super clear. I believe Obama had a bigger inauguration. But what Connolly introduces with alternative facts, I think, speaks to a kind of condition we're in today, where we are trying to navigate the relationship between what is true and what is believed. And I think that is something, at least in America, that happens both on the left and the right. And so we're all trying to figure out, what do we do with this condition where we don't agree on what reality is and even what the facts that constitute reality are. It's a kind of problem. It's a problem of causality. It's a problem of meaning. It becomes a political problem, it becomes a social problem. And so this is the sort of moment I think we're in. And so I think one of the things, one approach to this is to double down on the truth and say we will adjudicate and establish the truth. I think for the purposes of our consideration here, what I'm trying to entertain is that there might be another model by which we can sort of model the questions of multiplicity, of different perspectives. I mean, we all know about perspectivalism and the fact that depending on where you feel the elephant, you understand it as a different creature. I think one of the problems we have now as a culture is to try to understand multiplicities and not reduce to singularities, to singular truth models. I think this is what the counterfactual could allow us to do, and allow us to try to think about not alternative facts, but different ways of understanding the constitution of causality and reality as existing as multiples, existing not as the one singular winner-takes-all model, but partial definitions. It's a big claim, and what I want to do is try to situate how architecture, this field that we all belong to in some way, anybody watching this, I assume, would be interested in architecture or an architect. And I think, by architecture, I wanted to say, on a TV show, somebody who needs no introduction, architecture. But of course, architecture needs an introduction every single time. To my estimation, there is no definition of architecture that exists before its enactment. It's not a stable definition. It's one that changes and fluctuates over time. So not only does it need an introduction, it needs an introduction every time we start to think about it, I would say. And so for the purposes of tonight, even though I said it can constantly be redefined, I'm going to give it some very reductive definitions, sort of to set up the argument. The question of architecture, I think, in a way, comes down to what do we do? So in a condition of openness, if we want to build something, you think of it as like the tabula rasa, you can think of it as the blank page. First question is, what do we do? But almost immediately following that question is, why do we do it? So we can decide we're going to build a shed and we're going to build out concrete, but then very quickly it's, well, why this one and not that one? So there's a question of how do we adjudicate the possible alternatives, which I think unpacks as a kind of continual problem, a problem of definition, a problem of causality, and a problem of multiplicity. But even at a more fundamental level, I think the architectural act is to go from where there's nothing to where there's something. So there's no building there, something happens, then there's a building there. So in a way to parse this out would be from the broken or incomplete or unfulfilled into the perfect. Now this is extrapolating on both sides of that into like a more extreme condition. So I don't think buildings are ever perfect, and I don't think an empty site is broken, but I think it parses in that way. And I think it goes back to a kind of what Ernst Bloch would refer in his philosophy of hope as a utopian impulse. And in this book, he talks about all the various forms of art and architecture and literature which have this utopian impulse to improve society, to create images of betterment, of progress. I think it comes, we all know the term utopia, which is in a way a no place, so a place of imagination, but also the good place. And I think like whether we do it through the Greek etymology, I don't think anybody, envisions an architecture or makes a proposal to make things worse. They try to make it better, like at just a sort of fundamental level. But I think now, and every generation has its crisis. I think our crisis is a kind of crisis of meaning. And so here we have the sort of market floor, like literally this is I think the Chicago stock trade, commodity trading floor. So because we are all invested in the future, we're all invested in the good, but we don't share an ontology of that. We don't share a model by which we know how to make things better. So we engage in a kind of speculation. So in the marketplace, you speculate on what stocks you think are going to go up. And in architecture, depending on the style or approach, or you could call it your ideology, you could call it your design method, you could call it your tool set, but they're all speculations amongst the field, betting on that they're the right answer. And I think like just in this last week with the emergence of NFTs, we see the culmination of the market model and the aesthetic ideological model into like literally a shared marketplace. And so this sort of like late capital, neoliberal, speculative space, I think has a kind of like impasse. And I think both of the slide of the Trump inauguration and this slide, I think are both for me crisis moments, because the meaning is sort of like up for grabs. We don't know what it means. It's a kind of free-for-all. It's a kind of free-for-all, which is where we finally get to histories. And histories here, I really mean like architecture's histories, and how architecture sort of models, how can I say this? I'm not talking about Hegel. I'm talking about how architects understand, I would say almost inevitably, some relationship to that which preceded it, which is a history in terms of trying to figure out what to do next. And so here you could see an image like this. This is Thomas Cole's The Architect's Dream. You can see the architect sitting right there. He's sitting on a big book of architecture. On this vista behind him, he sees the collection of the great monuments of architecture, at least of Western architecture. And so this sort of like accumulation of I don't know, great moments or possible models or achievements is all sort of like clear and available for inspection. I think this sort of like conception as a kind of like, it's almost like we're looking back into a timeline. So you can see the pyramids in the background, and then the Greek, and then the Roman, and the Gothic as we come forward. And so we are looking back, literally looking back into history in this. But I think we can also like understand this schematically as a relationship between the real, which I think is what architects do. We construct the real, we construct buildings, we construct their habitation. But whereas at one level we're trying to go from the broken to the perfect, in another way, I think the real calls upon some kind of imaginary. So the imaginary, the real evokes the imaginary, evokes, the real evokes the imaginary. So it's almost sort of like a retroactive phenomenon. And I think that imaginary, for me, for our terms here, are sort of qualified by history. And history, maybe it's lowercase history. things which preceded and how we understand it. And so I'd like to go through just like a few models. It's almost a history of histories that I would propose here of different ways architecture as a discipline, or architecture as a field, the way it's understood history, which is that how it's understood that which preceded it. And so on the one hand, one version would be like a kind of developmental history. And this would be something like the progression of Greek temples from wood and the way that gets translated from a wood tectonic to a stone tectonic. And out of that comes the classical grammar, and it's a kind of like developmental logic. This begets this. It's a kind of refinement. Things get better. Things get more and more refined or improved as it moves along. You know, and this would be a model, an ancient model, but also would be a model we could understand throughout. We could also understand at another moment, and all of these examples are like sort of classical to get them out of the contemporary moment. We could understand a translational model, which is different than a developmental. It involves a sort of selection. So we can think of the Renaissance's relationship to the Roman as a kind of like selection, a going back in time to pick the right moment to sort of restart or re-establish one's relationship. So you can think of like Palladio's relationship to Rome, the Roman. And I have the arrows going both ways because it also invokes things like Piranesi's drawings of Rome, and so it becomes a bit circular in a way, but it's different than a developmental model because it involves a kind of like volition, at least on the part of the culture, to decide what preceded it. So the thing that precedes it's not the thing that just happened last week. It could be 100 years ago, it could be 1,000 years ago. There's a kind of volition in the selection. Then you get to another moment. You can think about like where the Renaissance goes and gets spread, goes to somewhere like England, where you have Indigo Jones, who becomes completely invested, writes a book, does drawings, of trying to understand or explain Stonehenge as a Roman temple. And so here we have a kind of like revisionist history where, I don't know, like I'm not convinced, but he did the drawings, you know, that this structure, which is sort of, you know, ambiguous and mysterious, and it's the Druids and how they do the stones. And Jones decides that he's going to like prove this thesis, which may or may not be true. It's probably not true. I don't know if he believed it was true, but it's a kind of conjecture. And again, I think this is a sort of like a revision. So it's not changing what's happening now directly, but it's changing, we could say, the thing that preceded it. So it's a kind of like changing of the record. These are all different ways the history translates back and forth. And then just to stay in this sort of like Roman classical and its derivations, we think of like Colin Rowe in his Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, in which he wants to say that like the relationship between Corbusier's Villa Stein and Palladio's Villa Malcontenta can be understood as, of course, happening at different moments in history, but also being equal in some way. There's a kind of trans-historical understanding that the passage of time isn't really what matters. There's certain architectural issues, and we can always go back and refer to them. I see Thiago furiously writing notes. There's not going to be a quiz after this. These are all just models of trying to understand it. And I'm just setting up this thing. All these other models is trying to set up this, that there is a way of understanding all of these various utilizations of architecture's history, the same way I say like all architecture is in a way has a utopian impulse. I think also implicitly all architecture has this achronic impulse, which is achronia, which refers to a fictional time period in contrast to physical lands. The word is a neologism of utopia, but it replaced topos with chronos. So instead of place, it's time. And so I think architecture exists in this sort of relationship. And that relationship then wants to understand that, like, yes, while architecture thinks forward in a kind of utopian speculative framework, I think also implicit in its very logic, it thinks retrospectively. It thinks about achronic or historical dimensions of time. And so architecture, I think, sits in between these impulses, which finally gets us to the counterfactual histories. And so what I want to set up is that, like, in this notion of the achronic, architecture's always had this like relationship to history that's fluid and somewhat imaginary. So what I want to do here is say that, like, this has been the case. This is part of the architectural imagination. And what I want to introduce with the counterfactual architectural histories is like another version of that. And add another palette, another color to the palette, another way of thinking about these historical relationships. And why do I think it's important now? Because I think in the same way that, like, the Trump alternative facts identifies a crisis of meaning, I think architecture too is facing its own sort of like crisis of meaning, which has to do with trying to unthink certain historical relationships. So, you know, trying to think through what architecture and how it might affiliate with other modes of being. And so if we think of the Vitruvian man as somehow like male, white, probably cis, anthropomorphic, I think there's been a lot of attention to architecture to try to think about like other definitions and what would that be. There's been a lot of critical attention, I think, to identifying what these lingering legacies are that I think have been like very enlightening. But I think what's missing is like a kind of historical or counterfactual imagination of like, well, let's change that input. And then what happens? How do we extrapolate out from a displaced Vitruvian man model into these other fields, and what might we get? And so what I think the counterfactual does is adds to us another card in the deck. So instead of just looking back to history to find the one we need now and then playing it, the counterfactual says we're going to cancel this one before and imagine something else growing out of it. And I think it's a cultural condition. I think it's happening in a lot of fields. And I think architecture might have a way of dealing with it constructively. And I think it's the counterfactual. The counterfactual history is not something I made up. It's an existing field. It goes by a lot of names. It's sometimes called alternative history. It's sometimes called speculative history. Or counterfactual history. It comes with a variety of conditions. This is an early book by Nigel Ferguson. It has a kind of like spotty record in the field of history. So at one level, its apologists would say gives us access to new historical imaginaries. Its critics would say it's too imaginative and it doesn't ground itself in facts. I can see both sides of it. I think architecture's relationship to history is a looser and more, how could I say this, more generative than maybe other fields. We've always used history creatively. So, but regardless of both its detractors and supporters, what it does is it's less about predicting the future, but again, just like counterfactual statements in philosophy, in history, what it puts on the table is causality. And causality, I think, very much is an architectural question. And it has to do with the notion of conception versus inhabitation. We design a building, we envision it's going to be used a certain way. We can't predict what will happen to it in the future. So we are already engaged in some kind of speculative question about what's going to become of our efforts. Now, the counterfactual history and literature, and here, this is the Philip K. Dick Man in the High Castle. This is where he, imagines an alternative outcome to World War II. In the literature on alternative histories, it's pointed out like it's become a kind of like increasingly popular, is that the right word, at the end of the 20th century into now. And it's really seen as a kind of sign of crisis. So that these things get more popular or more read at moments where these questions of causality and meaning start to become cultural dilemmas. And I think that's what we're feeling now. And that's why I'm trying to like put this in relationship to architecture. I'm trying to read what I wrote here. Yeah, because I think it deals with this question of like multiple truths. It's not the answer. It's in a way still the question. Now, what would that mean for architecture? Like, and how might it be understood as, you know, both of the moment, but also something different? I might offer this as another category, as an earlier version of the counterfactual. This is a sort of imagined history as model. So we have Castle Neuschwanstein, which is of course made for King Ludwig, who is a sort of romantic medievalist. It's not from 1500, it's from the 19th century. It was designed to look medieval. It was a new construction. It was itself a kind of like re-envisioning of a past moment to try to like make the medieval better than it was. And so it's a pictorial romantic recreation of the castle, which of course then becomes the model for, you know, the ne plus ultra of fantastic creations, Cinderella's castle. I think that's one kind of version that we could think about. And I think it speaks to this phenomena that gets identified in one of Luis Borges' texts, Dilan Ubar Obis Terrace. It's a short story from 1940 in which he's writing about finding this encyclopedia that makes reference to this country that he's never heard of. And the whole story, he finds other references to it and longer references and realizes it's a fictional thing that it was made by a group of people. And there's this whole discussion. But at the end of the book, what happens is that he starts to see relics of this imaginary country and imaginary world as they appear in the world. And I think that's also like very architectural for us, in that like these envisioned alternative histories, it's not like we wish the world into being, but those architectures become manifest in the buildings and seep into the real world in a way. So there's a way in which the speculative histories of imagining that the Nazis won the Second World War is a kind of like fantastical creation. I think architecture's fantasies migrate quite easily into reality. And so I think there's a kind of use value. Like it's valuable as a thought experiment to try to think through certain conditions, but I also think it's valuable as a way of like generatively envisioning new alternatives, for lack of a better term. So the format, like for this kind of thing, if I were to like make it into a diagram, would be, you know, some kind of input with some kind of active translation to make some kind of output. So if it was blank, then something would happen. And we could start to think about that at various scales. I did one. I think Thiago did some others. I think his might be better than mine, but I tried. For example, like in a very specific way, we could think about the Villa Savoye, you know, well-known, modern, classic building, manifestation of the 5 points of architecture, famous for the architectural promenade and the ramp that moves through it. A very minor thing. Corb's first ramp that he ever designed was for a slaughterhouse that he designed in 1918. You can see here the ramps, and the idea was that the cows would go up the ramp, get slaughtered, and then come down on a not so nice way. And so the translation of the cow's ramp becomes the ramp of its architecture. And it was a commission. It never happened. It was just like one job among many that he did at the time. Rather like not super significant in the office. But if it didn't happen, I really, you know, then we can start to question, well, like, if he never did that slaughterhouse, would he ever have really identified the ramp? And if he had never really identified the ramp, then maybe some of the 5 points would be there because they were already there in the 1914 domino, but the ramp would never have been there. So there would have been this alternative development. it's not the most pressing issue in the world, but I think it gives an example of how these speculations could find really specific moments to try to imagine alternatives for. And so to try to think about what that, Corbusian idiom was without the ramp might generate its own sort of interesting productions. I'm trying to argue this as ways of understanding history, and I'm just about to wrap up. But I'm still sort of invested in the zeitgeist. I still believe we're of a moment. And so when I saw this morning, I felt completely validated. This is a game on Steam, which is a game platform. It is called 5D Chess with Multiverse Time Travel. And what it is you play this chess game, but then you have the ability in the chess game to plot alternative moves. And so you're actually playing multiple games at the same time, able to sort of mock up these other versions of it. And so I think for me, it really starts to speak to some kind of notion of, as an image or as one that it's clearly this is something on everybody's mind, how we make sense of the sort of linear causality versus a multiplicity. We're seeing it now in game design. And I think it's a way for us to try to think about multiple alternatives and what their meanings could be. It's a lot, and it's sort of a lot to unpack. I hope I didn't, hope it made some sense and didn't go over my time.
I wish I had this, the video with the guy mind blowing live. As you said, I took some notes, which I don't know how I'm gonna use them, to be honest, because it's so much. Let's take a moment here in this time and see if we can. Okay, so really, thank you very much. It was amazing. It really touched on some every new concept you were introducing. I think was super interesting to see related to different media like cinema, and not like the Tarkovsky cinema, but like The Simpsons and Primer and the Bill Murray movie that is on the Every Day is the Same Day.
Groundhog,
yeah. So I think there's something interesting in this, because for me one important point to begin with, and I think it's a main difference in Brazil in the way we structure and understand theory here, or we teach theory, and how you do in the US, for example, is I will quote Bernard Tschumi, to define, we need to give limits to define architecture every time you start doing. And for us here, architecture is beauty. It's a material construction. It's a technical, social issue. And it's super interesting. Every time we start discussing abstract importance or the idea of discipline, we can see people going that's not the point. That's not what we, which I think this is important to start the discussion or to start.
Yeah,
talking.
If I could, because I think that's actually very helpful for me to try to situate some of the comments, because I had this suspicion that would be the case. And so I'm trained in the American Academy, part of the American Academy that was very enthusiastic about theoretical concerns. Trained at a moment, I would say the moment post deconstructivist theory. So my teachers were all, in a way, deconstructivist Marxists in various ways. So that sort of set a kind of framework for me. the question coming also out of this question of discipline in the 70s was something that I'm very much trained in. So it's the language I learned. I also thought like, well, one of the problems of those kind of talks, and I think I fell in, from your question, it seems like I fell into the same problems. One of the problems I found over time is like when you give these kind of talks in other contexts, here or Austria or wherever, it's a different context. They have different references, they do different things. So if you make it like really about specific things, it can be a problem. I think in America now, I find myself, we have a sort of post-disciplinary shift that's going on. I tried to allude to this about trying to think about other models, think about other gender models or identity models or racial models or even like human and non-human models. So all of these sort of like previously understood ways of describing the discipline have come under question now. And so it creates a kind of like enthusiasm for the new. I think part of my own like both enthusiasm for that work, but also skepticism is that the realization, I think, is that like some of these things that we talk about discipline are historical events. So Eisenman wrote something, Schumi wrote something, Koolhaas writes something. People do these things and we learn that history and it's a kind of educational process. But I also think there's a version of the discipline or another way of understanding the discipline, which isn't like you learn it and then you have it. They're kind of like more existential questions. And so I'm trying to like kind of understand these things in a different way. And that's why I think when I, attempted to do it in this talk is like, well, to architect, to like, and not to architect like a modernist or a Brazilian or in India, but like to architect means there's nothing and there's something. And once you do that, once you decide to do something, you can ask the question or not ask the question, but implicit is why. Implicit is, so some of these are like just fundamental questions. And so I think, I don't know, it's a way of talking around. I think I'm responding to this question of like the notion of discipline and its relationship to theory. I'm just now increasingly think that like we can jettison some aspects of like theory's history if we understand it as like a intellectual fad or a certain kind of moment, but it doesn't get rid of the questions. And so theories or disciplines answers might not have been the right answers, but we still have the questions. And I think the questions become really fundamental for me about like, why are we doing this? And I think in this talk, I'm trying to say that like, well, one of the reasons we do things is because we make something towards the future. And I think we all understand that when we think about speculation, we think about future worlds, we think about improving the world, we think about like, we're going to make this and it's going to become that. What I want to introduce is a kind of more reflection on history that's not just like a critical history. History was bad before, and now we're going to do it good. Because I think that's just incredibly naive. And to try to like both show that architecture is constructed in its relationship to history in the same way it's constructed in its relationship to the future, but also to open that up as like, well, we have multiple ways of understanding history. And frankly, maybe we could have even more. Maybe we need more in a way. It's a long way to like, I just regave my lecture, sorry. But I think it's more about these, for me, the question of like, when you say like, in this context, discipline and theory means something else, I guess it's a long way of saying like, it means something else in my own school, like right now. And I feel like it changes the requirements of theory or reflection or writing about architecture to put some of these fundamental questions back on the table as questions and not answers. So, which I think was the problem with the alternative facts model. The alternative facts model says, somebody says Obama had more people and somebody says Trump had more people. We kind of can see the evidence, but that doesn't really work for the people who believe the other thing. And so we need models of like multiple exchange. I don't know. Sorry, Thiago, I went too far. I should have stopped 30 seconds ago.
No, it's okay. So I was thinking maybe we have. I'm not gonna go into that. I just want to start with the idea of imperialism or colonization and how we are rethinking this now. But we are rethinking in a spatial condition, right? So we have the north and we have the south. We have like central and the periphery. But when you start to introducing time as a like a variable, let's say, I'm not. When we think about time, it could be like something like, okay, you start like the US start developing some theory into building, and then you change your course, or you change, like you said, a fad or a fashion is not fashionable anymore. Talk about I don't know, Eisenman or something. But there's one time that this narrative continues, right? So and let's say in 1914, 1923, Europe and Russia and Brazil had the same book. That is the new architecture. And then you read the book, and then you move on, and you read another book, and you did another building. But Brazil continued only with this book or going into this book. And there's a split in time, in timelines. I'm thinking on Primer, the movie. I don't know if you know this one. It's like the craziest time travel movie. And you have these timelines of people that are real, but they are like the copy of the time they go back and go forth. So if we try to decolonize time in a way, we see that this is a contested theory, but like there's one time and we are in different times in this line, which is not what I'm saying, because it's a very progressive, refined. It's just to say like Europe is better than the South, but there are like multiple times and histories continue, and we don't know, like the chess game. And for me, like this is your argument in a way.
In a way, no, it's interesting because I think the David Lewis, the philosopher that I refer to, like he gets into some of these things as he continues to the thinking. He writes a very interesting piece on the paradox of time travel, which deals with this notion of both paradox, but also, what is it, multiple realities or like parallel time streams, or like the sort of theoretical implications of all that. It's very sci-fi. It would be a great primer for Primer. And I think what I'm saying here is different than like, I'm not arguing for a quantum theory of history where all histories exist and we can like, you know, and this when you evoke popular culture, I think these concepts make sense in ways because they're in this game, but also like the last big Marvel movie, the Avengers Endgame, was all about time travel and multiple realities. And so it's in the world, like the world is working through these things. I'm not arguing that there's another dimension we can go to. What I'm arguing is that, like, at least for my field, architecture has a history of playing with histories, of creating parallel worlds that happen to be our own world. And so like the Villa Malcontenta is a parallel world where the Romans kept building and build that thing. And so, you know, my talk is really to try to like open up imaginaries about history. And so I think in questions of like colonialization or question, like to envision the what if that didn't happen, the what if it happened differently, the what if a second book got read after, instead of Towards a New Architecture, it was Frank Lloyd Wright's Weymouth portfolio, like what would happen? You know, I think architects do this, and I think to like, I'm really just trying to underline another condition where the imagining of those virtualities becomes, I don't know, becomes part of the the imagination of thinking about what architecture is or was or could be. Because I think what I'm experiencing in this sort of like, yeah, I think with it, in that way, because I'm arguing like all these things happen simultaneously, and they happen in the real world, and they happen as like contingent hypotheses as opposed to like singular beliefs. So like if we think about, towards a new architecture or international style, which gets understood as like a single monovalent one way to do things, which has like been critiqued now for 75 years, if we then understand like multiplicities, different ways of understanding history, different ways of architecture, I think that's a positive. We need to understand the ways of like evaluating or experiencing that. I think as we bifurcate in every vision, I don't know, and this is more about like questions of identity, questions of if each group has its own reality, then there's no cross connection. So we have to understand all these things happening simultaneously in the world all around us so we can understand multiplicity. And architecture as a cultural product can help us out of this problem of understanding singularity as like, this is the truth and this is not the truth, because that's not going to get us out of our current condition where people understand things differently.
Is that, I think in a way it's trying to avoid the postmodern problem of not having a big narrative.
Yeah.
Meaning doesn't matter what you say. It's like, since there's not one truth, everything is true, or everything is a lie, or whatever goes, which,
yes,
I agree, is not, maybe it's not productive. We cannot talk the same language anymore. Maybe we try to split and went like too far.
No, I think that's very productive and helpful for me, and sort of goes back to my earlier comment about like, oh, you read my dissertation title, maybe I'm back to where I started, because my dissertation was on Charles Jenks and postmodernism, and I think his version of that was trying to think about multiplicity after a singular modernism. Yeah, I think those are still, for me, there's the kind of stylistic version of postmodernism that we've gone through, but I think the cultural dilemma of like understanding difference, we're still struggling with. Like, it's a later version. So yeah, I think it's, for me, the arguments start as out of cultural concern and try to put it into architecture's tool set. Because I think architecture can think about models of creation, but also think about models of causality or justification. Yeah.
On that, can I bring Tolstoy again, like War and Peace?
Yeah.
Because you said, for example, Charles Jenks, and Jenks, I first of all, I love him. But he has like 100 books, and 95 of it is like skyscrapers, bizarre architecture, crazy random things in LA. So there are these multiple narratives, the multiple truths, and whatever people like and everything. But there is one Charles Jenks that pretty much liked this and chose to not say something about this building or that building. And to me, that's like the narrative of the Groundhog movie, because there is Bill Murray, which is Charles Jenks, and he knows everything and he chooses. But there are like 1,000 different people that may or may not meet today,
right,
and cross my path. Like, I know there's like this guy that's really annoying guy, the insurance seller, if I remember. And he chooses like, okay, today I'm gonna be mad, today I'm gonna be super nice with this guy. So maybe postmodern is already very singular, very selected by Charles Jenks in all his different one things. like sameness, or now I bring War and Peace, when Tolstoy says that like there's no heroes, no geniuses, because the inevitable march of events is the idea of contingencies. Like things are happening. It doesn't really matter if Napoleon gave that order or not. Like,
Sure.
there's 20,000 warriors fighting, and maybe you didn't even listen, and then you like put your sword. So I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think that's super interesting. I think on the contingency question, on the Tolstoy question, yeah, this is the critique of counterfactual histories. Like this is one of the critiques is, another version of this is the butterfly effect, where you step on a butterfly in prehistoric ages and then everything changes. Yeah, I think this is one of the, unverifiable, but like theoretical questions is like, does agency matter? Or are we just subjects of an unfolding condition? This is what Tolstoy gives us. I want to put architects in there somewhere. I don't know. This, like, I'm still invested in personal agency, and I'm still invested in authorship, and I'm still invested in like the potential and morality of putting a wall here versus putting a wall here. That has to matter in some way. It might not change the world, but it has to matter. It has to, like, there has to be something to this. And so maybe this is like nostalgic, but I'm just still invested in the project of, I don't know, intentionality in architecture. Maybe not to like, and that it affects things. I want to bring up the Charles Jenks thing because I think you have a really good point about it. I want to argue that Charles Jenks is like a reverse Bill Murray in Groundhog's Day. So Charles Jenks' early work, I like his work a lot. I think you identify it very correctly. He was almost too prolific for his own good. So not only did he do 1 million books, he did over 9 editions of the language of postmodern architecture, each time revising it and changing it. And even then, before then, I think and when I say of reverse Bill Murray, he started in a place that was very interesting. He started in a place of trying to understand a world that's full of difference, full of different approaches. If you think about his evolutionary diagram, there's all these different points broken down into 6 different strands. His whole project was trying to talk about, like, there's not a singular perspectival point. It's all about multiplicity. And if you read, and this is sort of the dissertation, but if you read all those versions of the language of postmodern architecture, you realize he's editing away difference. And so what starts off as like massive multiplicity, parallel multiplicity, becomes in the end postmodernism, capital P, capital M, which means, in the end, it's a kind of version of a jinky classicism. You can see it in the covers even, if you just look at the covers one after another. So what I mean by that is, like, Bill Murray goes from being sort of inchoate to being a good person. Bill Murray, I guess Jenks also ends up as a singular thing, but the earlier part was the better part, where he was really dealing with multiplicity and didn't define that thing. So I think in some ways, even still, like, this notion of the counterfactual history is, yeah, I think parallel to that early Jenks stuff, the pre-postmodern, as trying to think about, like, how do we understand true difference in architecture, not only as a visualization, but as an ontology, as ways of meaning, of ways of constructing the world. And I think here in this moment, trying to introduce this counterfactual history as a way of giving it, I don't know, a more specific registration, which could span both the creative practice of the designer, but also the kind of practice of the historian to generate alternatives as opposed to singularities. Just to say, I like Jenks' early funny stuff.
Mm-hmm. And Madelon's drawings that he has in the book. Like when you say there's some questions, I'm trying to connect this.
Sure.
Yeah, but I'm thinking when you say like this master narrative or this one, like counterfactual is different from alternative facts because, and if you didn't use this word, but you can say alternative means lying, right? Or can mean lying. Uh, for example, you are very polite in your presentation to say, I believe Obama's inauguration had more people than Trump. I would say I believe too, but it's not a question of faith, but it's a question of having the truth or choose to lie. Um, why I'm thinking about this? Because uh, history is written by the winners, right? That's like probably an old saying. But at the same time, we can say, or at least I feel here in our context, in space and time, that the winners are writing history, which could be the same, but it's completely opposite thing because now if you won, you can say whatever was before, right? And I think counterfactually, you can create an imaginary, but you cannot lie, right? It's very I don't know. I see this. The argument I'm trying to
Yeah.
say is that what if it is true and it is positive, and it's not like what if the Nazis won the war, and then we're gonna have like exactly the same world. They won, but then why he was the winner, and why there was a war, and why it's called war. You can change everything since you're in retrospect. You're retroactive writing your manifestos. And I think it's
yeah. I think you're quite right. I think you're quite right, Thiago, to say that like alternative facts is different than counterfactual. And yes, I would say being ironically polite regarding that issue. Like I think we can count the people. We see the image, but I guess the implication for me is one cultural. Like the question of alternative facts, we can understand it two ways. We can understand it as a lie, like that basically it becomes a scaffolding for just like pure ideological expression, which, I think in some ways it is. But if we step back at a broader survey of culture, this is not like to be a right-wing apologist, but we understand it's like people are understanding the world differently in ways that create a crisis for meaning. And I think that crisis, I don't know, like I don't have the answers for all these things. I'm just noticing this parallel with architecture's own sense, because it's going through its own kind of like, I don't know, its own sort of like crisis of meaning. And like, how could we think about it differently? I just think, for me, alternative facts is the context in which we operate. Like, and this is about like sort of qualifying, when I say architecture always has to qualify itself, that's kind of what I mean. I think we have to make claims about like why we're doing something versus another thing. I don't know, but I think in a way architecture is also like, it's not the same as everything. It's inherently ideological and inherently somewhat interpretive. And so we have like our ability to have two alternative facts that are actually true, I think are greater than the question of that crowd. You know what I mean? Like we're always going to be a little bit interpretive. We're going to be a little bit speculative. We're going to be a little bit like constructing our argument. The question of shelter is easily solved. The question of what it means culturally is impossibly a dilemma. And so that's where I kind of feel like these kind of trying to think through, like, how do we construct, say, in this example, the historical grounding of what we do seems like it could parallel what's going on in culture now, even if it's at a slightly different register. So when I say like, oh, this could solve the problem, I don't think this solves the problem. I think it rehearses it in a different way. The same way I feel like, oh, well, that 5D chess game rehearses how we understand multiplicity in its own sort of format. I mean, I don't think, it's not that I'm trying to say truth doesn't matter, but I'm saying truth's not going to be enough for all these fields. And so maybe we need other ways of thinking about how to construct that belief, which is where it becomes ideological.
I'm thinking, well, two things that I want to ask, and then there's a lot of questions, but the first is the idea that truth, there's like, what I think is interesting in the name counterfactual, and I might be reading this in a wrong way because I'm not like an English expert, but it means that there's a fact, right? And there's one thing that is against the fact, or a different. It's not against as a fight, a combat, but it's a multiplicity of a fact. And I go back to Corbusier when you say the cow ramps that he built, right? Or that he didn't build, which is super interesting, because he made this design for cows, and then he didn't build this, and then he has this urge to like, this is a really good idea, I'm gonna copy this again at the Soviet palace and the Savoy. And so and then what if he had built this, right? What if he,
that's interesting,
like, what's gonna happen to the world, like our Nazi versus imperial idea of Corbusier did fulfill his wish to have a ramp for cows, and now he's like a very small architect in the Swiss cow farms, which, but then in a second, and then bringing again Tolstoy, is like maybe Guibourg was the guy that wrote Style and Epoch, and everybody read, and we read here in Brazil, and now we're doing ramps and silos and airplanes. So just one thing that I wrote on my list is that he didn't build, he had the urge, but then history, in the inevitable march of events, turned, and I guess you know, but turned the Ville Savoie into a cow hay deposit. During the war, there was like a barn, which in a way, you know,
fulfills that diagram.
Always fulfills there's a ramp and there are cows and there's a Le Corbusier building. So even if he did or did not, does it matter? Like, is it a fact or everything is a counter fact, you know? I don't know.
I mean, this is just because we studied it in a seminar. We looked at Towards an Architecture in a reading seminar for the whole semester last year. One of the things we also realized or found out, like, he spent a lot of his early career trying to make a business, trying to become a concrete block dealer. And so you wonder what would have happened if he was a little bit better businessman. He would have just like not done anything. He would have, like, I don't know, maybe. I think, I don't know, I've got to reread my Tolstoy, if nothing else, for good quotes. But I think the question is, like, do we understand architecture as a world historical force like Napoleon marching to Moscow? Or do we understand architecture like, I don't know, Jules Verne writing about, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Like, it's a question of like, where is it like, a materialist practice, which we can definitely call it that, which is going to be subject to economies and pressures and forces and sociality and inevitabilities. We could definitely have that version. I'm also just trying to articulate, like, in some ways it's also speculative and generative and capricious in relationship to facts. I mean, part of this is about a kind of like culling of imaginaries and imagination in architecture as a kind of something we could be marshaling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you touched on Jules Verne, which for me was one of my notes, because in my reading since I was a child, he never gave any answer, or that was not the point. There was just a plot stuff to make questions to. What if we will go to the center of the earth? What if we travel the world? Which is very close to me to one text that I always give to students. It's Architecture for Museums by Aldo Rossi. And he said, like, it doesn't matter, like, it's always the same questions, and we always like trying to understand, repositioning ourselves. And that's why what a school of architecture must do, like create these things. And really, I will really shorten this to open new questions. But when you said like Napoleon going to Moscow, I think, to me, especially, this is a really interesting question. Like, is it architecture, is Napoleon going to Moscow, that we have a dream, we have an objective very clear, and we want to go? Or is Napoleon going away from Moscow? Like, we get there and we're like sacking and burning everything, and now we need to run to whatever, maybe we get to Paris, maybe we don't know. Like, it's a very contingent thing to just keep walking and see. So we have this opposite, like,
it's very good.
We might be going, or we might be like coming back from Moscow. I don't know. I'm just like really loving this, and I feel we can stay here forever, which is not possible. But I don't know if you want to say something, or I can go to the questions.
If there's questions, I think this has been super enjoyable. I really appreciate it. I don't want to like test everybody's patience. So if there's questions, I'm happy to answer them, but I'm also happy to like wrap it up.
Yeah. I think Mitre asked, so can we say that we do architecture continuously, always as a process, to continue changing our imaginations, evolving cultures, and reconnect the broken and perfect again and again? So in the end, every architecture could possibly have traces of a multiplicity of precedents. And I loved your answer. Yes.
It's a short answer because I didn't know if you were going to get to it. But yeah, Maitri, I think the question, this brings us back to Thiago's correct identification of the lingering postmodern aspects of this. In the postmodernism of Jinx, all those precedents would be visible and legible. I think the argument I'm trying to say here is that it's like, these architectures are reliquaries of our previous understandings of that which preceded us. Conscious or no, unconsciously or consciously, I think we're reacting to historical forces, and those historical forces could be, they're modeled lots of different ways. Some of them are materialist, with dealing with like economies and availabilities, but I think some of them are cultural, for lack of a better term. We can call them ideological, we can call them cultural. So when we make a teepee, or we make a temple, or we make a Pueblo dwelling, or whatever, we do it in relationship to that which preceded us. I think the Pandora's box of architecture is that we open up that question, and it becomes an increasingly difficult question to answer once you think about it.
Yeah,
But I think it's there
because then
nonetheless. Think about it or not, it's already the traces are there.
You go to this 5 points, 5 history of histories that you say, like, you can choose how you're gonna see this, but you always, the answer is yes, but
Right.
something that we need to ask. Okay, Sabine, do you think this tradition of building history of histories is specific to architecture in different ways, or is it different in other disciplines? What are the differences?
It's a very good question, and it's a question I'm utterly unable to answer because I don't know. My subject formation is in architecture. My 3 degrees are all in architecture. It's the medium through which I think. And my answer is always that architecture is just a little bit different. Now, I don't know if that's right or not. Some fields I think might be more similar, more different. In terms of questions like this, I always think about, like in the theory class, we'll often read philosophers writing about architecture. And it's always interesting and it's always comical because they seem to get architecture wrong. They seem to somehow fundamentally misunderstand what architecture actually is, even if they have interesting ideas to think about. So I put myself in that same condition for thinking about other disciplines. Anything I say or imagine would, I think, would be laughably imprecise about how they construct it. I do think other fields, I mean, this is a sort of history of science question. I don't know. I think architecture is super important. I don't think it's as important as medicine. I don't want my doctor to do a counterfactual surgery on me. I think we have a little more latitude. So I sort of embrace that freedom of our particular field.
You'll be surprised of what the doctors are saying here in Brazil. It's, I think they are very counterfactual. But yeah, this reminds me, well, the history of Bernard Tschumi, Eisenman, and Jacques Derrida with this whole, like, you didn't understand what I was saying.
Yeah, no, precisely. Yeah, that's a very good example.
Beatriz. Yeah, I think that's an interesting. Beatriz asked, like, if like the idea of progress is maybe this positivism of, like, progress is always to the better and we are moving to the future instead of looking for alternatives, for example, the Eurocentric white rich male. I will reframe this as, is it your objective writing or thinking about this to rewrite history or reimagine, not re, but imagine the future history of architecture, like not write the past, but write the future, or it doesn't matter? Yeah.
No, somewhat. Look, I want, at a super, like, there's all these cultural, theoretical things I'm interested in. I'm also just interested in ideas proliferating. I think this question, the first part of Beatrice's question, I think it's very interesting because it evokes this notion of progress and change. This is a different part of the project, but you'd mentioned the title of this is like the postponing the end of the world. And so I've been thinking about the apocalypse a lot for a while, as we all have in different ways. And I think we're coming to, like, these sort of, like, post-oil, post-peak oil, these questions of, like, what does a future look like that doesn't involve progress? Like, that doesn't involve, like, creation or using more resources. I think that's another access. And then the question is, like, because you see it in studios, at least in America, where they start to envision a post-labor life. Like, what does that mean? Which I think has to do with, like, changing the conception of progress. I don't know. It's not really an answer to the question. I think one of the modes of progress that may continue might be cultural. Like, in terms of resource allocation, cultural imaginaries might be our new growth industry, which is, you know, a different thought, and this gets us back to the NFTs in a way, even though I think it's kind of in a one way ridiculous because it's like money for nothing and blockchains and I'm too old to understand it. But in another way, it kind of makes perfect sense because it's just like ideas in exchange as virtualities, and you're starting to see architects do it too. So I'm interested in progress, even though progress might mean something different as we look forward. And for me, progress is architectural ambitions continuing in whatever way it can continue. Imaginations of built buildings, imaginations of imaginary buildings. But I think I'm definitely a kind of like, more is better. More ideas, more images, more thoughts, more conversations. Yeah.
It's like when we're thinking about utopia, we're talking like Eduardo Galeano has this saying that it's like the horizon, that every time you give one step closer, but the horizon moves, and so why we have it to keep walking, right? And I think when you put like this achronia, is like, okay, we need to postpone, but in what Krenak says in the book is very interesting. Is like, it's not that we're gonna end the world and like this doom, everything is just nothing, but it's we need to postpone it to be able to tell another history, to have a little bit more time to tell another history. And I think time is it's time to say something else, to give a history, to continue.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of also connects to the broader project on this question of apocalypse, and having looked at that, when you look at the apocalypse, they're often, like, even in the definition of the term, they're often not the end of, they're end of one world and the beginning of another. And so I think we used to, and culturally, think about like the apocalypse was nuclear Armageddon, all the humans die into the world. I think now in a sort of post-human, non-human way, it's like, well, the other things are there. Other things, there was a book that came out maybe 10 years ago called The World Without Us that took as a hypothetical, like what would happen if humans just stopped existing? Not from a war, not from starvation, just went away. And how long would it take for the earth to like erase all traces of that thing? That's a kind of apocalypse. I think it's like, it's not the, and this is when we, like in 2012, when the whole question of like the Mayan calendar and people understood that as like the end of time. And then they get to it and they figure out, oh no, it wasn't the end of time. It was just the beginning of another age. And I think like these fantasies of the apocalypse are oftentimes just recalibrations to something completely different. It may or may not involve you, but there's some kind of continuity. And so, yeah, I think this is all related in some ways. It's like massive epistemological change is a kind of apocalypse for those who are, involved.
Yeah, maybe there are no like clocks anymore, but the time will continue.
Yeah.
In a very random, weird way. This one, I would say, like the final question. If Mitre said, like, do you think media could be positioned as a predictive device of future past architectures, along with being an entertaining medium of fantastic worlds? And again, like, if media could be a predictive device, also as an entertaining medium, which I think is one thing I will ask something like in the lines of, can we have fun? Can we enjoy? Like, can we watch a movie and talk about theory, philosophy, or philosophy has to be, like, can a class of architectural theory be nice that the students love to go, or it's always dreadful? And just like because I will give an architectural example. You brought the castle, and then you brought the Cinderella castle, and I will put the third as Michael Graves' hotel,
Sure.
Disney with the Mickey Mouse thing, the Seven Dwarfs, because it's like the cyclical. Yes, it is fun. It is interesting, but it's still like it's very Greek and formal, and you can learn about orders. But instead of like a leaf, it's a dwarf.
Right.
Can this imaginary?
One would hope. I mean, this is more a question for my students than it is for me. I would say that's the ambition. And I think it also has to do with, like, I don't know, it goes back to this question of discipline we had before. And then do we understand the discipline as a kind of protective shell of specialized knowledge, which we create acolytes of who like can repeat the lore? Or do we use it as a kind of like slang to talk about issues that are related to architecture, but also imagine them? I think today we've talked about Tolstoy, but we've also talked about Groundhog's Day. And I think both are completely appropriate, and that we understand architecture as, something that's like involves technique and technology and structures and life safety and all these important things. But it's also in parallel conversations with books and movies and video games, and like it's part of that. And so I think that's fun. I think that's understanding the world around us through a particular lens. But that's what, I don't know, beautiful about being part of a society, is seeing these different things and understanding their alikeness and difference. So I don't know. I think it's fun. I hope I hope students find it fun. And I think maybe one way is that it becomes less specialized and more tries to understand itself in a relation to other fields. I think that's something that's happening now. The 70s, I mean, and I think the definitions were still true, but the discourse was one of an autonomy. What is particular to architecture alone? And I think that made numerous significant theoretical insights that I still think in some ways are valid. But I also think in addition to autonomy, you could think of architecture's relationship to heteronomy, to difference, and it's a likeness or difference to video games or computers. And I think that's where it's fun. Video games are fun, right? Still, right? We're not completely off video games.
Yeah, I just wanna like wrap up. I think ending with fun is always interesting. I think there's a lot of, if you understand architecture, maybe building is the end, building cities, building buildings. But if we see architecture as the lenses we use to see everything, maybe it could be fun. One, just a side note to end. When I was thinking about what to ask you for, what to propose, and I wrote about the program article, I was really thinking on your Instagram, that is our contact. You always post some movies you're watching like Saturday night, and many of them are like fun movies, right? And I think, why can't we see, because I don't think Groundhog Day is an architectural movie. I don't think Die Hard is an architectural movie, or Indecent Proposal. These are movies I use in class to talk about, like Louis Kahn and Indecent Proposal, Die Hard and the served and service spaces. And I think maybe, if we have fun, we can look at things and this Hans Holling, everything is architecture, because I'm enjoying it and I love it and it's nice.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Thiago, I have to jump in. You say they're not architectural movies. I would say they're not architectural movies. They're not, they're not designed by architects, but they're architectural logics throughout. And I think that lens, maybe more or less in other places, can apply. I mean, for, like the castles example, that was from a thesis group I did a couple of years ago where we did castles for thesis. But then we also have done like movie musicals. So I don't know, maybe it's just as I continue to teach, I find like you don't have to start with architecture to end with architecture. At this point, wherever I look, there it is. In some way, shape, or form. Organization, movement, coordination. These are the lingua franca of architecture, but also the world around us. Can't escape it. It's always going to come.
Yeah, I hope with these talks that like with this hour we're talking and all the other discussions, we can, I mean, we can love architecture a bit more, like as a friend, as a amateurs, like the amateur versus the professional that the Italian designer wrote. But maybe I feel my protest that I'm doing here as a real political protest for everything that lead to this is that, for example, theory had dropped out of school. Literally, like theory classes we don't have anymore because we need to cut because like budget and all these crises, we need to cut hours of school. And the first one was like, okay, theory it's this little something that we can throw out, but we need to be technical, we need to be responsible. And I'll say, okay, I understand, but maybe theory can be also relevant, important, and useful, maybe more than one more drawing lesson, one more escape route. I don't know, but at least we might have it. That's why the discussions are happening, or I want to. Anyways.
That's great. That sounds fantastic. Yeah, thanks again for inviting me. This has been a fantastic talk. I've gotten so many good corrections from your insights that I'll take with me. And thanks for making this space available.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks your students also, yeah, and you're invited for the next ones. And John, thank you very much for like really quickly answering my protest and my call. You are really great. Thank you, and I'll see you soon, I hope.
Okay, thank you.
And everybody, take care.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.